Hey, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this. I have several things I want to unpack today and not a lot of time. So, if it's okay with you, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. But it is interesting to me because I'm not a missiologist, but people who are smarter than I am have identified three main responses that we have to sin. Human beings have to sin: fear, shame, and guilt. And that actually different cultures tend to emphasize one of those and maybe even de-emphasize the other two. So the shame, fear, guilt, these are these kind of moral emotions, deeply seated emotions, responses that we have to sin in our lives. Why does it matter? Because the majority world is coming to us. I mean, I think sometimes we might think, oh, it's just missiologists or missionaries that are traveling halfway around the world that need to care about these things, and they do. But the majority world, by the majority world, I'm talking about Asia, Middle East, Africa, Central America, South America, Caribbean. That's the majority world, or some people call it the global South. But it is this world that in many ways is coming to us. And we need to understand how to articulate the gospel in a way that really scratches where they itch and that makes sense to them, that made sense to their worldview. I would even suggest that we probably need a more robust, a more full, a more faithful, actually, understanding of the gospel. If you look at scripture, if you open up the pages of the Bible, the folks who wrote scripture and the audience certainly that they were writing it to probably had more in common in terms of worldview, probably had more in common with our majority world neighbors than us Westerners. And so I'm speaking to I don't know, who all is on this call. I'm sure there's some majority world brothers and sisters on this call today, but I guess I'm speaking specifically to the Westerners right now. So the reality is that not only do we want to be able to communicate the gospel in its full-bodied beauty that it is, but we actually also have something to learn from our majority world brothers and sisters. They have something to teach us about this incredible gospel that we're a part of. So let me take a few minutes, if you don't mind, and I'm going to unpack these three kind of worldviews when it comes to sin. We'll talk about guilt first, and we'll talk about shame culture, and then we'll talk about fear culture. So guilt culture is what a lot of us are probably most familiar with. It's a product of individualistic societies, so mostly Western North America, Eastern Europe, or Western Europe rather. And in a guilt culture, we're going to define sin as breaking the law or breaking rules. And when someone breaks the law, what do we want to do? We want to seek justice, right? We want to make things right again. They need to be punished, or they need to ask for forgiveness, or whatever it is, it needs to happen to make things right again. And so the way that these kind of cultures work is that you regulate behavior by rules. You regulate behavior by what's right and by what's wrong. There's a strong sense of law and justice. And so the good news of the gospel entering into a culture like that tells folks that the gospel is about forgiving sin. Because the reality is that, if we're paying attention, we're all tortured souls. I think of like Martin Luther, maybe even John Wesley a little bit, are like these examples of this, these tortured souls that had this strong sense of God's anger towards their sin. And it's almost an individualistic perspective, right? That says my state in relation to God's, when we're paying attention to our state and in comparison to God's holy law, eventually we're going to realize after trying for a while that we don't measure up, that we can never actually measure up. And so that's when Christ comes in and he makes it possible, right? But the reality is that this view is not the view of the majority world, actually. It's not the view of a lot of our, immigrant neighbors, and maybe even increasingly some of our own, younger generations. So let's talk about the other two now. You've got guilt culture, but let's talk about shame culture for a few minutes. Shame, honor culture, this is collective societies that are very connected to one another relationally. So Middle East, many Eastern cultures would fall into this category. And sin in a culture like this is a failure to fulfill group expectations. So if I fail to fulfill the group expectations, then I bring shame, not just to myself, but I bring shame to my family, I bring shame to my community, I bring shame maybe to my country. And so there is a desire, a need actually to restore honor. That's how you make things right again, is to restore honor. So the way that a shame culture regulates behavior is that it's going to praise the kinds of behaviors that elevate the common good, and it's going to scorn, it's going to ostracize the person who engages in behavior that is individualistic, or that engages in behavior that makes the group look bad somehow, makes the family look bad, brings shame upon the family. So let me give you an example of this. I have a friend who is from a collective society. She is from Central America, and she had a death in her family. And she traveled home for this funeral, which wouldn't seem like that big of a deal, except that she really couldn't afford it. It wasn't financially feasible for her to do that. And on top of that, traveling home actually meant that she was putting her immigration status in jeopardy. She wasn't supposed to leave the country because of her immigration status. And so she was putting all of that in jeopardy. She did it anyway. And it, defied all common sense. And for me, from my kind of Western culture, I would say, like, my goodness, of course I would want to go home for a funeral. I would want to be there to support people. I'd want to be there just for, closure, all those things. But if I couldn't go, surely people would still understand. If it wasn't possible for me to go, people would understand. And if they didn't understand, then, too bad. At the end of the day, I can't worry about what other people think, right? But my friend, the idea of not worrying about what other people think, number one, is like something that probably wouldn't have even crossed her mind. But death in a collective society, or a funeral in a collective society, carries tremendous potential for either family honor or family shame. And so it matters who is there at the funeral. It matters who participates. It matters what type of food you serve. The procession matters, the rituals matter, what people wear matters. It all matters because all of it brings honor to the memory of this loved one, to this person who's died. And so to do anything less than your absolute best is to bring shame upon the family. And so she did. She traveled all the way back. But okay, so in a shame culture, the good news of the gospel looks like restoring honor, not just to yourself, actually, but to God, to Christian community. It means, the good news of the gospel means that you have worth, that you have value. And it's more than just forgiveness of sins. It's this idea that the gospel takes away our shame, takes away our alienation from God, that we are welcomed into community, that we belong, that we're included, that we're restored to community, that we're chosen, we're valued, we have worth, all these things. And I think we see this in scripture a lot. I think of the leper who, Jesus had touched the leper and cleansed the leper. In fact, he said, "You are clean." So he'd been healed of his disease. And yet, even after all of that, Jesus tells the leper to go back to the priest and present himself to the priest so that he could be announced to escalate. But there was this idea inside of the culture there that said, yeah, we know that you are actually physically clean, but there's this importance of being restored to community, of belonging, of being included, of being welcomed back in again. And anyway, I think, if we're paying attention, we see this all the way through Scripture. It's a huge idea here. Okay, so we've talked about guilt culture. We've talked about shame culture. Now let's talk for a minute about fear culture. And this shows up in mostly animistic societies, tribal societies, or at least societies that have been historically tribal, because even if they're not so much tribal anymore, it's still oftentimes something that's there in the psyche of the culture. But a fear culture, people have a tremendous fear of evil and of harm. There is a real awareness of the spiritual forces of both good and evil, a belief in their reality, and they're at work all around us. So in a culture like this, the good news of the gospel says that, guess what? You have freedom from fear. You have freedom from bondage. And the good news of the gospel takes away our helplessness, takes away our hopelessness. It's the reality that we have victory over power and over sin and over evil, that we're on the winning team, that we don't have to live with this sense of powerlessness anymore, that God is our provider, all these things. Okay, so it would be really rare, I think, to find someone who, or a culture, I guess, that adheres to just one of these worldviews. In reality, it's a combination. Like, we all have bits and pieces of all of these. But nevertheless, I do think that certain cultures tend to emphasize some over the, and so it's that kind of cultural orientation, whether it's guilt or fear or shame, that shapes our worldview. It shapes our ethics. It shapes our view of God. It shapes our own personal identity. It shapes our idea of salvation. All these things become really, really shaped by that worldview. So our understanding of these different worldviews should influence the way that we communicate the good news of the gospel. I mean, that's pastoral, right? Is to understand who our people are, who it is that God is calling us to reach, and understanding what makes them tick. Understanding how to communicate the truth of the gospel in a way that connects with them. And the reality is that these folks from the majority world are all around us. They are in our cities and in our communities and in our schools and in our neighborhoods and hopefully in our churches. And so it really should affect the way that we preach and the way that we teach and disciple and witness and invite people into Christian community. It's interesting because I work with young adults, right? I'm a professor at Southern Wesleyan University, and I noticed this, and I think there's actually growing research out there that would agree with me, but that young adults in America are becoming more and more shame-based. Even though we are a guilt-based culture, I think, successive generations are connecting more and more with this kind of shame culture worldview, this value for authenticity and for connection. In fact, in my classes, I do this survey where, it has this questionnaire that tells you whether your worldview is more shame-based or more guilt-based or more fear-based. And some of my students are really split, actually, between guilt and shame. But the bottom line is, I think the most accurate articulation of the gospel is going to include dynamics from all three of these worldviews, because we see all three of these worldviews in Scripture, right? Let's just start with, I won't go into great detail, but let's just start with Adam and Eve in the garden, this inauguration, unfortunately, of sin in the world. And Adam and Eve, suddenly they eat the fruit and they understand right and wrong. They know that they've done something wrong. They have this sense of guilt, right? But they also have shame. It says that Adam and Eve covered their bodies, that they hid from God because they were ashamed. Now we also see fear right there in the garden. God asked Adam, why did you eat the fruit? And Adam says, I was afraid. I ate the fruit because I was afraid. So here, not only do we have the majority culture that is all around us, the global South is coming here into our community, and we welcome this opportunity to learn from them and to also share the gospel. Much of the global South already, many of them are already believers, but for those who are not. But I think increasingly our own culture actually is connecting more and more, particularly with a shame worldview, and becoming more and more shame-based. So it's interesting. I have had, as we've talked about this in class with students, and we've spent time wrestling with this. I have had students who said to me, like, this kind of blows their mind a little bit. They kind of see the gospel just break out of the box, maybe, that they had it in, and say things like, look, I have asked for forgiveness for my sins, but I still carry so much shame. And I've had other students who go, I have asked for forgiveness for my sins, but I still struggle. I'm paralyzed by anxiety and by fear. And I wonder sometimes if our focus in the West on guilt has left us with maybe only this partial understanding sometimes of the gospel. So, man, I would love it if we could reclaim the gospel of Scripture, this big, beautiful, robust, storied gospel that connects with all people of all worldviews, and it knows how to slice to the heart in a way that brings transformation. So that's my prayer for you as we go. Thank you.